Hey everybody, it's Emily bringing you another Grass River micro class. Yes, it's May, and yes, it's snowing. But that's the adventure we get for living up here, right? Okay, right, that's what I keep telling myself. So today I wanted to focus on something that's really exciting that happens in spring, and that is the emergence of a lot of great edible plants and fungi. So we're just gonna go over 4 today, keep it simple. There are a lot more than that, but at the end we'll talk about some great resources that you can use to learn more too. First, a note of safety. Of course, never eat anything unless you are absolutely positive you know what it is. And by absolutely positive, I mean you have consulted multiple sources. And preferably you've gone out with an experienced forager and they have identified it for you if you are a newbie. Yeah, so today we're just gonna get started with quick 4. All right, let's see what we can find. And by the way, all 4 of these are gonna be organisms that are relatively easy to find, many of which you can find in your own backyard. So this isn't something where you have to go like out into the wilderness to find them. We're gonna start right in our yards.
All right, so numero uno is the dandelion. This should be a super familiar plant to everyone as it grows pretty much everywhere. Yards, parks, anywhere that's a disturbed ecosystem. And, you know, really easy to identify. There are a couple lookalikes, but what you really want to look for in a dandelion is that the stem is hollow and it produces a sort of milky latex. So you want to look for that latex. It's a little bit sticky. And then the leaves should have points on them, and the points should be pointing back to the center of the plant. You don't want these lobes on the leaves to be rounded. You want them pointed and center and pointed back to the center.
And the cool thing about dandelions is that you can eat pretty much every part of the plant. Most people love the leaves, especially the young leaves when they're just after they've come up, so now is a great time to forage for them because they do get pretty bitter as they get older. But those can be used raw. Just make sure you wash them first, like in a salad, or they can be like steamed or wilted like you would with spinach. And then the roots can also be used as a substitute for coffee. What you do is you dig up those roots and then you clean them really well first. And then you can roast them for a long time over a low temperature, or you can dehydrate them. You just want to basically get all the moisture out of those roots, and then you grind them up like you would coffee beans, and then you filter them in a coffee filter just like you would make coffee. And there are lots of great recipes for dandelion root coffee substitute online. And then you can also eat the flowers. They're edible, and a lot of people use them to make dandelion wine. So yeah, basically every part of the plant is edible. I don't really recommend eating the stem because it's got that milky latex in it that's super bitter. But yeah, the root, leaves, and flowers are all really great. And there's not really much to harvesting dandelions, except for the fact that because they grow in yards and parks and those places, you just want to be really careful that the dandelions that you are foraging for have not been in an area that's been sprayed with any sort of pesticides or herbicides, because you really don't want to be ingesting those things. So just be careful of the spraying history of the area, but otherwise go for it. Dandelions are delicious.
All right, next edible is one of my favorites because the plants are so delicate looking. This is a wild violet. And we have quite a few species, a lot of species of wild violets in Michigan, and they readily hybridize, so they're pretty difficult to identify individual species. But from everything I've read, it's okay to eat all species of wild violets in the viola family. But again, just be really careful that you fact check that, because do not rely on me for all of your foraging info. So yeah, violets can be, the classic deep blue violet color, or they can be white or even yellow, or like this lavender colored one. But the flower shape is the same across species. and it has 5 petals in a really distinct arrangement. 1 that's pointing down, 2 that are on the side, and then 2 that are on top. And also it's got this kind of nodding stem. So the flower kind of hangs off the stem downward. The stem droops a little. And they've got these nice heart-shaped leaves that have pretty, the edges are almost scalloped. Like I wouldn't even call them toothed because they're not sharp, but they're shallowly scalloped, heart-shaped leaves. And these grow, this one is in my yard, but yeah, anywhere that is relatively moist. So yards, but also moist deciduous woods.
So I should mention that our wild violets are in the genus Viola, and African violets are in the genus Streptocarpus, so they are not at all related to our wild violets. Eating African violets will make you very sick, so don't do that. My cat has decided to join us. Celebrity cameo. Okay, so for our wild violets, both the leaves and the flowers are edible. The leaves are a little bit bland, but they have a bit of like a sweet pea taste to them. So you can use those raw or cooked. Just be sure to wash them. The flowers, though, are the best part. If you've ever had the cream liqueur called Violette or Violet, or I don't know how to say it, I'm not fancy. That is flavored with violets. So that's what violets taste like. Super floral, really yummy. Yeah, they're just one of the best springtime woodland snacks, I think. So the flowers can be made into jelly, or they can just be tossed in salads or eaten raw like I just did. Nice pop of color. Oh, one really cool thing about violets is you might think that if you eat the flower, you know, then you're inhibiting pollination and then the plant won't reproduce. Not true with violets. They have a backup pollination method because they bloom so early in the spring, and you know the timing that they bloom might not exactly coincide with when flying insects can fly. Like today, it's way too cold for mason bees and sweat bees, which are their main pollinators, to be flying around because they're, you know, ectotherms and they can't regulate the body temperature and they would basically die. So in order to get around that issue of maybe their bloom time not coinciding with when the pollinators are flying, they have a backup method. They have these little things called cleistogamous flowers at the base of the plant. I would show you one, but they don't appear until after all of the regular flowers have withered up and dried out. So they're not there yet. But yeah, these cleistogamous flowers are self-pollinating. And so it gives the plant a backup method. It doesn't have to rely on the insect pollinators to carry pollen from one flower to the other. But the disadvantage then is that they are, it's an asexual form of reproduction. So those flowers, those seeds that are produced by those cleistogamous flowers are clones of the parents. So that's not inputting any genetic diversity into the population. So yeah, it's a little bit of a trade-off, but it does allow the plant to reproduce if its flowers don't get pollinated. So don't feel as bad eating violet flowers as you would other flowers because they have that cleistogamous flower.
All right, friends, here we have the Fable, the legendary morel mushroom. And I am ridiculously lucky enough to have these growing in my backyard. It may or may not be part of the reason why we bought this house. Just kidding. But usually you can find them growing in the early season, kind of on the edge of woods. And then as the season progresses, further into the woods. They do have mycorrhizal relationships with certain trees in the area, like ash, aspen, possibly elm. So people often say that looking near those trees is good. But really, you know, there's a lot of lore out there about how to find morel mushrooms. Really just got to go and put some good time in looking in the woods. So there are a few species that can be confused with this true morel, and those are collectively called false morels. But it's really quite easy to identify them once you know what you're looking for. So this true morel, you can tell that the cap, so the part of the mushroom that isn't the stem, reaches almost all the way to the ground. It's conical shaped. It's got kind of pits in here on the cap instead of wrinkles. And the real telltale sign, I think, is that when you slice the morel open lengthwise, it should be totally hollow on the inside, all the way from the tip of the cap to the base of the mushroom, to the base of the stem. It should not look like it has some cottony fibers in there. It should be completely hollow.
And there are very specific harvesting guidelines you should follow when you are foraging for morels. What you really want to do is clip the morel or just pinch it with your nails. You can clip and like use scissors or a knife if you want, but nails are good too. Clip the base just above the ground. You don't want to ever pull it out because you don't want to pull out what's called the vulva, which is like the protective cup that the mushroom sits in order to create a better chance that the fungus will send up another fruiting body, another mushroom in that spot next year. Another thing you really want to do is carry mesh bags. You don't want to carry them in like a plastic or a paper bag because those don't allow the spores to be released and kind of be sprinkled along as you walk through the woods on your foraging mission. Mesh bags really allow that to happen. So what you really want to spread the spores in the morel to ensure that you get as many morels as possible coming back in the next season. And interesting fact, one morel can have up to 500,000 spores in its cap. So that's really important. And then when you get home, just make sure you clean them really well. You can just soak them in a bowl of water. I like to cut them lengthwise and then soak them, which just gives them a little bit of a deeper clean. But soaking just gets all of the dirt and the grit and any bugs that are hiding in those pits out. Then you want to dry them off really well so you get a nice crisp sear when you saute them in butter, which is my preferred method of making morels. And I tend to have a lot of people that agree with me, at least as far as the internet says. And then you can use those sauteed morels to just eat on their own if you have a lot of them. If you don't have a lot, toss them into eggs, into pasta, use them to top any sort of protein. Yeah, probably the most prized spring edible. They're delicious. On the heels of the morel, we have another spring edible that people seem to go crazy for, but for good reason. This is the ramp or wild leek. It's really easy to identify these wide leaves they should be like a Kelly green in color, and then almost reddish roots down here, or stems. And the best way to identify it is by its smell. Like it should smell super oniony and garlicky. I suppose it's easy I suppose that it would be possible to mis-ID something like an iris or a lily of the valley with ramps, but really, like, if it smells garlicky and oniony, it's ramps. And these are really pretty easy to find around northern Michigan in deciduous woods. Anywhere that you would really find trilliums, or right now it's growing next to some spring beauty and some Dutchman's breeches flowers and trout lilies. So anywhere that you see like the deciduous wood spring ephemerals, you'll probably find some ramps too. And there are some pretty strict harvesting recommendations that I have with ramps, because I know it often doesn't look like it because sometimes it grows in these huge patches, but it can be pretty threatened in different parts of its range. So yeah, and one reason for that is because these plants can take up to 7 years to produce a flower and reproduce. So we want to be really careful when we're harvesting them to harvest them in a sustainable way. So the most sustainable way to harvest them is just to pick one leaf, because you can see that each plant has 2 leaves, and so picking one allows the plant to continue to live that season. If you really want to take 2 leaves, you can do that, and the plant will overwinter with the bulb and then send up new leaves next year, so you're not killing the plant. If you insist on taking the bulb, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you cut off the roots. So what you'd want to do is dig in the soil until you see, you know, the white bulb, it'll look like an onion or a garlic. And then what you want to do is using a really sharp knife, just cut off the bottom third of that bulb that still has the roots on it. It looks like, you know, like the bottom of a green onion. And that will resprout next year. So you're not killing the plant, you're still giving it a chance to make its way all the way to flowering and reproduce. And the best way to use ramps is just how you would use garlic or onions. So, you know, you can eat them raw, you can cook them like you would use garlic and onion in any recipe. Or another great way is to make ramp pesto out of them, which is basically just taking a standard pesto recipe and then replacing the basil leaves with ramp leaves. Yeah, and they're delicious. Very pungent, so you don't need a lot of them in your food. And one more thing I forgot to mention, and this goes for any plant that you're harvesting out in the wild, don't take the entire patch. You know, you want to leave some behind so that the plant can reestablish that colony. So general rule of thumb, anything between 10% to 1/3 of the patch is okay to take, but nothing more than that. All right, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Hope you learned something. And if you want to continue learning about foraging, some great resources are 2 great books that I recommend. There's more out there, but the first one is Midwest Foraging by Lisa M. Rose. I like that one because it's specific to the Midwest. And then Forager's Harvest by Samuel Thayer is kind of a classic one that doesn't go into a whole lot of detail into a ton of species, but it goes into a lot of detail into like the most common ones that you might find. So those are great places to start. Also, Grass River usually teaches a couple courses on woodland munchies, edible plants, edible and medicinal plants in the summer. We'll see if that can happen with the current state. But also, we have some other great resources in the area too. If you want to check out Know My Foraging, it's Clay Bowers' organization, and that's just Nomi, N-O-M-I, forager.com. He's a great person to learn from. He teaches a few classes through NMC Extended Ed. I've taken some with him. Great teacher, knows a lot about foraging. And then if you're more interested in using wild plants in herbal medicine, so more medicinally, I would suggest checking out Bare Earth Herbals. That's Bare as in B-E-A-R. And that organization's founder, Sierra Bigham, is a great resource for herbalism. All right, so until next week, friends, stay warm out there. Bye.